They found bones, hundreds of them, tiny, broken, nameless beneath what is now a peaceful park, and one bracelet with the name Atsa. He was 6. No one warned you about this in school. Watch now, because if you turn away, you'll never understand how justice was buried next to the children. The sun had barely begun to stretch its arms across the red earth of the Navajo nation when 6-year-old Atsa Yazzie woke to the sound of his mother's hands grinding cornmeal in a wooden bowl. The rhythm was familiar, comforting a soft percussion that echoed the heartbeat of his people. Outside, his father was feeding the sheep, humming an old song passed down from his grandfather. The air smelled of juniper smoke and dawn. That morning felt like any other. Until the horses came. Atsa was tying the laces on his moccasins when the silence broke, split by heavy hooves pounding the dry ground, growing louder and louder, like thunder rolling in from the mountains. His mother froze mid-motion, her hand hovering above the bowl. Outside, the sheep scattered. His father stood motionless, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the approaching dust. Then came the wagon, and the uniforms. 3 men in gray and tan coats, government-issued. One of them held a clipboard. Another had shackles hanging from his belt, clinking like ghosts. The tallest of them dismounted and marched straight toward their hogan. "Yazzie family?" he barked. Atsa's father stepped forward, his voice low. "Yes, I am Nez Yazzie. What's this about?" The man flipped a page. Child number 23. Yazzie Atsa, 6 years old. His mother rushed to the doorway. "He's just a boy. By federal order," the man interrupted. "Your child is being taken to Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania. It's the law. Refusal is punishable by fine, imprisonment, or forfeiture of tribal aid." "We never agreed to this," Nez shouted. The man nodded toward the wagon. "Your agreement isn't required." 2 men stepped inside. One of them grabbed Atsa by the arm. The boy screamed. His mother lunged forward, wrapping herself around her son, pleading in Navajo. "He's our only child. Please. He's not ready." The soldier shoved her aside. "Speak English, woman." She fell hard, hitting her head on the doorway beam. Atsa reached out to her, tears streaking down his dust-covered cheeks. "Amma, Amma." Her voice cracked as she crawled toward him. "Atsa, don't forget who you are." But the wagon door slammed shut. Inside, Atsa huddled in the corner with 3 other children. One girl, maybe 9 years old, was cradling a doll missing an arm. Another boy was whispering something in Lakota, then stopped abruptly, his lips trembling with fear. Through the narrow slats of the wooden walls, Atsa could still see the outline of his father standing alone in the rising sun. Then they turned a bend in the dirt road, and home disappeared forever. He didn't know what Pennsylvania was. He didn't understand why they needed to cut his hair or change his name. All he knew was this: he hadn't even finished tying his shoes. And now, the morning had been stolen. The train hissed like a sleeping monster, its breath thick with coal, smoke, and sorrow. Atsa sat stiffly on a wooden bench near the back of the rail car, flanked by children just like him, dark-haired, dark-eyed, wrapped in silence. Some had cried themselves to sleep. Others stared straight ahead, their faces blank, as if they'd already left themselves behind. Atsa clutched his knees to his chest, watching the trees rush past the window, blurring into a never-ending wall of green and gray. He had never seen so much sky, so many wires strung overhead like invisible fences. For 3 days, the train moved without mercy, stopping only to collect more children. With each stop, the car grew fuller, quieter, heavier. No one told them where they were going. No one needed to. On the 4th morning, the train screeched to a halt at a small town blanketed in gray fog. Atsa saw the sign as they passed it, Carlisle. The name meant nothing to him yet, but it would come to haunt his dreams. The station was cold, the air sharp. Atsa was one of the last to step off the train, his legs trembling. Men in uniforms barked orders. Women in stiff black dresses held clipboards, pointing and separating the children. Older boys to the left, girls to the right. Younger boys like Atsa lined up in silence. A white man in a pressed coat crouched down to Atsa's eye level. He had a thin mustache and a practiced smile. "What's your name, son?" he asked. Atsa hesitated. "Atsa Yazzie." The man nodded and scribbled something on his clipboard. Not anymore. From now on, you're Atsa Yazzie. Do you understand? Atsa blinked. Alan? The man smiled wider as if he'd done something kind. Alan. Like Alan Pierce, our superintendent. It's a fine name. Atsa wanted to scream that his name was Atsa, that it meant eagle in his people's tongue, that it was the name his grandfather had given him beneath the stars. But instead, he nodded. A small, broken nod, because everyone who resisted got the belt. He was marched across the compound, past rows of brick buildings and chimneys puffing smoke into the pale sky. In the distance, bells rang sharp and unwelcoming. The school felt like a prison, though no one called it that. They called it civilization. The first stop was the bathhouse. He was ordered to strip naked. His clothes, handmade by his mother, were tossed into a bin and burned. Atsa flinched as his favorite shirt turned to ash. Then came the lice, check a man with gloves, and a cold expression poked and prodded him like livestock. The water was scalding, the soap harsh, and the scrubbing relentless. Atsa coughed as they poured something foul-smelling over his head. Then, the chair. He was bolted to the floor in the middle of the room. A boy just older than him was already seated in it, shivering. Two white women in aprons circled him, scissors in hand. Snip, snip, snip. Locks of long black hair fell like feathers to the floor. The boy trembled as they cut. His jaw clenched so tight he couldn't speak. When it was Atsa's turn, he tried to run. He made it as far as the doorway before a hand yanked him back by the arm and slammed him into the chair. No more running, the woman said. It's just hair. But Atsa knew that wasn't true. His hair was sacred. It connected him to his ancestors, to the land, to his identity. Cutting it meant cutting him. He sobbed uncontrollably as the scissors hacked through his braids. One of the women clicked her tongue. You'd think we were hurting him, the other replied flatly. We're helping him. When they were done, a mirror was thrust in front of his face. The boy staring back at him was not Atsa. His head was nearly shaved, his skin blotchy from scrubbing. His eyes, once wide with wonder, now dulled like stones at the bottom of a river. The woman handed him a set of itchy wool clothes and stiff shoes that didn't fit. Put these on, Alan, she said. He didn't correct her. He didn't say, my name is Atsa. He just obeyed, because he was too tired, too cold, too ashamed. Later that night, lying in the bottom bunk of a room filled with strangers, he pressed his hand to his head where his hair used to be and whispered his real name into the dark. Atsa. A small voice across the room whispered back, I remember mine too. He turned. A girl, maybe 10, peeked through a crack in the wall, her eyes wet with tears. They called me Tani. I don't know what they call me now. Atsa didn't answer. He didn't know what to say. Instead, they lay there in silence, two ghosts of children who still remembered who they were. But for how much longer? The bell rang at exactly 6 o'clock. Its cold clang slicing through the misty Pennsylvania morning like a blade. Atsa jolted upright from his bunk. The scratchy wool blanket tangled around his legs. The dormitory floor was freezing. 20 beds, 20 boys, all rising in silence as the sound of boots echoed down the hallway. Stand straight. Hands by your side. No talking, barked the dorm supervisor, a tall man named Mr. Brody, whose voice never rose in anger because it didn't need to. The belt on his hip did all the talking. Atsa scrambled to his place in line, still adjusting to the uniform that didn't quite fit. He dared not look at anyone. Eye contact was dangerous here, an invitation for punishment or worse, attention. The routine was strict, mechanical. Breakfast at 6:30. Oatmeal so thin, it looked like rainwater, served with dry toast and silence. The only voice allowed was the voice of prayer, but not his prayer. Before eating, all students were required to bow their heads and recite the Lord's Prayer in English. Not Navajo, not Lakota, not any of the dozens of tribal languages whispered from mother to child for generations. Atsa struggled with the words. The sounds felt foreign in his mouth, like pebbles instead of prayers. He fumbled a syllable once and was struck across the knuckles with a wooden ruler. Enunciate, snapped Sister Margaret, the head matron. That night, his hands throbbed as he tried to remember the correct pronunciation. He whispered the prayer again and again, like a song that made no sense. But deep down, he wanted to scream Hozo Naazli, the Navajo prayer for balance, for harmony, for healing. He hadn't said it aloud in weeks, because here, language was a crime. After breakfast came language instruction, a class where Indian talk was the enemy. A large black sign hung above the chalkboard, English only, speak Indian, get whipped. Atsa sat stiff in his wooden desk, heart pounding every time the teacher circled behind him. Across the aisle, a girl whispered something in Ojibwe to her seatmate. The teacher froze, turned. You, stand up. The girl rose slowly. Repeat what you just said. She looked down. 1. I was just... Crack. The whip hit her desk with a sickening snap. You will speak the language of the civilized world, he hissed. The girl didn't cry. She didn't even blink. But her lip trembled, and Atsa saw her bite the inside of her cheek until it bled. That night, she was gone from the dormitory. No one mentioned her again. Sundays were the worst. Church services in a cold stone chapel, stained glass windows portraying stories they didn't understand. Atsa sat in a pew between two older boys who had learned to stay still and quiet. The priest spoke of salvation and sin, of heaven and hell, of lambs and shepherds and blood. None of it made sense to Atsa. He looked at the crucifix and felt nothing, because in his world God didn't hang from a tree. God was in the wind, in the fire, in the earth beneath his feet. But when he tried to speak of it, to share what his grandfather had taught him, he was called blasphemous. The devil hides in false gods, said the priest, glaring, and your people worship spirits that must be cast out. Atsa was made to kneel on raw rice for an hour. His knees bled. One afternoon, weeks into his arrival, Atsa was sweeping the chapel when he found an old book wedged behind the altar. It was small, leather-bound, and fragile. Inside, tucked between the pages, was a folded paper covered in handwritten lines, delicate Navajo script, faded but still legible. It was a prayer, a real one. From his people, his hands trembled. He whispered it under his breath, and for the first time in weeks, he felt something alive inside him again. He could almost hear his mother's voice. Just as he folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket, Sister Margaret appeared. What do you have there? She asked sharply. Atsa froze. Nothing, sister. She narrowed her eyes. Empty your pockets. He hesitated, just for a second. That was enough. She struck him across the face. The paper fluttered from his hand onto the chapel floor. She picked it up, read a line, and sneered. Heathen nonsense. She tore it into pieces and dropped them into the candle flame. As the prayer turned to ash, Atsa felt something inside him collapse. Not his bones, not his skin, but his belonging. That night, Atsa didn't speak, didn't cry, didn't move. He just stared at the ceiling, eyes open, counting the cracks in the wood. Across the room, a boy began humming something soft, low, a melody Atsa almost recognized. It was a song from home, but wrong somehow, as if the tune had forgotten itself. Atsa wanted to join in, wanted to hum with him, but the fear was too strong, the silence too heavy, and so he remained still. One prayer had been burned, but thousands more lived in his bones. They couldn't beat that out of him. Not yet. By his 9th month at Carlisle, Atsa had stopped asking questions. He woke up when the bell rang. He recited the Lord's Prayer in perfect, flat English. He walked in straight lines, folded his hands just right, said yes, sir, and no, ma'am, with a calm, hollow voice. To the teachers, he was a model student. To the priests, he was a sign that the Indian in him was finally fading. But the truth was darker. Atsa hadn't become obedient because he believed in the rules. He became obedient to survive them. Each punishment he had witnessed, each slap, each belt, each child vanished overnight, etched itself into his memory like a scar. And so he conformed, not out of respect, but out of fear, out of strategy, out of quiet, invisible resistance. He folded himself smaller every day until they stopped noticing him. That's when the real test came. It happened on a Wednesday. The sun barely peeked through the clouds as the students marched into chapel for morning devotion. Atsa took his usual seat, 3rd pew, right side, hands folded, eyes forward. Next to him sat a new boy named Chaska. He had just arrived from Minnesota 2 weeks prior, spoke mostly Dakota, and carried with him a fire that hadn't yet been crushed. Chaska was always watching, always questioning, and he hated the rule that banned their languages. That morning, during the final hymn, Atsa heard a whisper. It was Chaska, not in English. He was humming a sacred Dakota lullaby beneath his breath. Soft, gentle, defiant. Atsa froze. He knew the consequences. As soon as the service ended, Sister Margaret called out from the altar. Someone was heard singing an unapproved chant during worship. This is a holy place, and heathen traditions will not be tolerated. She scanned the pews. Her eyes landed on Chaska. Was it you? Chaska didn't speak, so she turned to Atsa. You were sitting next to him. Tell us the truth. Every pair of eyes in the room shifted to him. The moment hung in the air, taut like the string of a bow. Atsa felt his throat tighten. His palms began to sweat. He looked at Chaska. The boy stared straight ahead, unflinching, brave, proud, but Atsa hesitated. He remembered the bruises on his back, the taste of blood from biting his tongue too hard, the girl who had vanished for speaking her mother's name aloud. He looked back at Sister Margaret, and he nodded. Yes, sister, it was him. The room went still. Chaska didn't look at him, not even once. Two orderlies dragged the boy out by his arms. Atsa sat in silence. He didn't eat lunch that day, or dinner. That night, lying in bed, he turned to face the wall and whispered to no one, I'm sorry. But there was no reply. The next morning, Chaska's bunk was empty. His name was removed from the roll call, his belongings cleared out. No explanation, no discussion, no grief allowed. He had become another ghost in Carlisle's long hallway of silence. Later that week, Atsa was called into the superintendent's office. Mr. Pierce, a man with a perfectly parted mustache and hands too soft for the kind of place he ran, looked up from a letter. You did the right thing, Alan, he said. You showed character, discipline, courage. Atsa didn't speak. We're promoting you. Hall monitor. You'll help the younger boys follow the rules. We need good examples like you. The man smiled. We're very proud of the man you're becoming. That night, Atsa received a small silver pin to wear on his collar. It meant power, authority. But when he looked in the mirror, he didn't feel proud. He felt empty. His reflection was polished. His hair cropped short. His shirt pressed. His boots shined. He looked like them now. Spoke like them. Walked like them. But inside, he was fading. One evening, as he passed the garden shed behind the dormitories, he heard crying. Low, muffled. He opened the door. A small boy, barely 7, sat huddled in the corner, holding a worn leather pouch. It had beads, feathers, and a name carved in wood, Elu. The boy looked up, eyes wide, afraid. I won't tell, he whispered. Atsa stared at him, at the pouch, at the fear in the boy's voice. And for a split second, he saw himself 3 years ago being pulled away from his mother's arms, clutching a name no one was allowed to say anymore. He knelt down beside the boy. What does it mean? He asked softly. The boy sniffled. It's my father's. He said it would protect me. Atsa nodded slowly. Then he did something he hadn't done in years. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a tiny piece of thread, the last shred of his mother's shawl, hidden all this time. He tied it gently around the boy's wrist. Don't let them take it from you, he whispered. Then he stood, straightened his collar, and walked out, because he was still Alan on the outside. But for that brief, fragile moment, just for a heartbeat, he was Atsa again. By the time Atsa turned 12, he no longer flinched when someone called him Alan. He answered to it automatically at roll call, in class, in church, in line, for the tasteless porridge that passed for breakfast. The name fit now, like the stiff collar of his uniform, not because it felt right, but because he had worn it long enough that it no longer scratched. And yet, there were moments, sharp and quiet moments, when he would catch himself listening for something else. Atsa, that sound, that name, like wind through canyon walls. But it never came. No one at Carlisle spoke it. No one remembered it, not even him. It was a Tuesday morning when he was paired with a younger boy named Jonah during study hour. Jonah was fresh from the Navajo reservation, barely 8, and still had the wide, alert eyes of someone not yet broken. Alan, the teacher said, placing a hand on Atsa's shoulder. "You'll help Jonah with his English. He's been struggling to adjust." Atsa nodded. "Yes, sir." He sat across from the boy, opened the English primer, and pointed to the first word, apple. Jonah blinked at it. His mouth opened, then closed again. Atsa said the word slowly, apple. Jonah tried to copy him, but his voice caught on the L. It came out soft, unsure. Atsa looked into his eyes. "You have to try harder," he said. "They'll punish you if you don't." Jonah's gaze dropped to the book. His fingers traced the edge of the page, trembling. Then, barely a whisper, he spoke in Navajo. "I don't understand this. I want to go home." Atsa felt the words hit like a slap to the chest, not because they were rebellious, but because they were familiar. Words he hadn't heard aloud in so long that they sounded like thunder in a forgotten canyon. For a moment, something inside him stirred, something buried but not yet dead. He leaned in, his voice low. "Don't speak that here. They'll hear you." Jonah looked up. "What's your name? Your real one?" Atsa hesitated. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came. He searched for it, his name. Not the one given at this school. The one his mother had whispered into his ear as he slept beside the fire. The one his grandfather had carved into a drumhead. The one the wind had once carried. He couldn't find it. He couldn't remember it. That night, Atsa stood in front of the cracked dormitory mirror and stared at the boy looking back at him. The boy had straight shoulders, a clean haircut, a face without expression, but behind the eyes, there was something hollow. He whispered to himself, "My name is..." Silence. He tried again. "My name." Still nothing. Tears welled up before he even realized it, slipping quietly down his face. He wiped them away before anyone could see. The next day, during chores, Atsa was assigned to clean the supply closet in the chapel. It was a dusty room filled with old hymnals, broken candlesticks, and crates of unused communion wafers. As he swept the floor, something caught his eye, an old filing box shoved into the corner beneath a shelf. Curious, he pulled it out and opened it. Inside were dozens of index cards, names, dates, tribes. It was a list of every student who had ever come through Carlisle. He flipped through them. Bluebird, Thomas, Cheyenne. Running Elk, Maria, Lakota. Two Feathers, Jonah, Navajo. He turned another. Yazzie, Allen, Navajo. A number was stamped in the top corner. Hashtag 2317. He stared at the card, heart pounding. And then, faintly, just beneath the printed name, a pencil mark, half erased, like a ghost whispering through the paper. Atsa. His breath caught in his throat. There it was. His name. His real name. Written by someone who had tried to preserve it, quietly, before it was replaced with a more acceptable version. He ran his fingers over the faded letters, as if trying to pull them back into being. For a long time, he just sat there, holding the card like it was a heartbeat. Then he folded it gently and slipped it into the inside lining of his boot. Later that night, in the darkness of the dormitory, he whispered again, "My name is Atsa." It came out raw, shaky, but real, like breathing after being underwater too long. Across the room, Jonah stirred. "You said something?" Atsa paused, then answered quietly. "I remembered." Jonah sat up in bed, eyes wide. "What?" "My name," Atsa said. "I remembered my name." For the first time in years, he slept without dreaming of stone walls and falling hair. Instead, he saw a bonfire under the stars, his father dancing to the drumbeat, his mother's voice singing his name into the wind. But even as the warmth filled his chest, he knew the truth. In Carlisle, no one would ever call him Atsa again. They had chosen Allen for him, and every day they expected him to live up to it. But deep beneath the surface, hidden in the lining of his boot and etched into his bones, he knew who he was. Even if no one else ever said it aloud again. Winter came early that year. The Pennsylvania sky hung low and colorless, and every breath Atsa exhaled seemed to freeze in the air, like the pieces of himself he'd slowly lost. He had learned how to walk without being noticed, how to work without asking questions, how to disappear in a room full of boys who had once been warriors, dancers, storytellers, and were now just numbers in matching uniforms. But even numbness has limits, and his cracked heart found one in a boy named Kiona. Kiona arrived in late November. just after the first snow. He was small, no more than 7, with almond eyes and a quiet smile. They assigned him to the lower bunk beneath Atsa's bed. He barely spoke, but when he did, it was always in a whisper like he was afraid the walls could hear. The first night, he clutched a tiny bundle wrapped in deer hide. Inside it was a stone, smooth and black. He said it came from the stream near his home on the Hopi Mesas. Atsa warned him gently, "Hide it. They'll take it away." Kiona nodded, but kept the stone near his chest as he slept. His hand always curled protectively around it. Over the following weeks, Atsa found himself doing something he hadn't done in years, caring. He showed Kiona where to stand in line so he wouldn't be shoved by the older boys. He shared what he knew about the punishments, about who to avoid, and when to speak, if ever. He even saved half his bread roll once and slipped it to Kiona under the table when the younger boy's stomach growled audibly during chapel. It wasn't just pity, it was something deeper, familiar, like looking into a mirror of who he had been before. One night, Kiona whispered through the bunk frame, "Can I tell you a secret?" Atsa hesitated, then whispered back, "Yes." "I used to sing to the stars," Kiona said. "My grandpa said they could hear us if we used our real names. I haven't sung since I got here. I think they've forgotten me." Atsa closed his eyes. He remembered the stars too, but he didn't know what to say, so he just whispered, "They haven't. Not all of them." 3 days later, Kiona didn't show up for morning roll call. His bunk was empty. The stone was gone. No one said anything. Not the dorm master, not the teachers, not even the other boys. Atsa asked a supervisor where Kiona had gone. The man shrugged. He was moved. Or maybe he got sick. Doesn't matter. But Atsa knew. They only moved children quietly when something went wrong. That night, he searched. The laundry room, the back corridors, the shed behind the chapel, even the punishment cellar he once scrubbed on his knees as part of a weekly chore. Nothing. No trace. No sound. No name on the clipboard outside the infirmary. No explanation. Just gone. Later that week, Atsa overheard 2 teachers talking in hushed tones. Found him in the storeroom. He wasn't breathing. Only 7 years old. They'll say it was exposure, maybe a fever, a pause, poor thing. But these kids, they don't adapt. Well, do they? Atsa stepped backward into the shadows before they saw him, fists clenched so tight. His nails drew blood from his palms. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat on the edge of his bed and stared at Kiona's empty mattress. He pulled the thin blanket aside. There, tucked into the corner of the frame, was something small, barely visible. The black stone. Smooth, still warm. Atsa held it in his hands, and something in him shattered. He walked outside, barefoot in the snow. The cold cut through his skin like glass, but he didn't stop. He kept walking, past the chapel, past the field where they used to line up for Sunday service, until he reached the back fence. The wind howled around him, but he didn't hear it. He crouched down in the snow and began to dig, not with a shovel, with his hands. He dug until his fingers turned purple, until the pain disappeared into something else. He dug a hole just deep enough. Then he placed the stone inside, not like a grave, more like a marker, a promise. He whispered, "Your name is still in the stars. I will not let them forget." In the distance, a bell rang. Atsa stood slowly. He looked up at the night sky. The stars were dim, but they were there. Somewhere, he hoped. Kiona was among them, singing again, no longer afraid. He walked back in silence, back into the building, back into the system. But now something had changed. The numbness was cracked. The silence no longer sealed. Because for the first time in a long time, Atsa felt. He felt rage. He felt guilt. And above all, he felt remembrance. He wouldn't forget Kiona. He wouldn't forget the others either. Even if the world tried to bury them in snow and silence, he would remember. The news broke quietly, just a scrolling headline at the bottom of a local evening broadcast. Unmarked graves discovered at site of former Indian boarding school. It was 2021, more than a century after Atsa had first arrived at Carlisle, and the world had long since moved on. New wars had come and gone. Technology had changed the way people lived and spoke and remembered. But the ground never forgot, and one day, a shovel finally cut deep enough to wake it. The site was in Pennsylvania, overgrown with weeds and forgotten memories. What once was the boys' dormitory had become a collapsed foundation buried beneath ivy and dirt. Construction workers had been preparing the land for a new public park when they uncovered something unexpected: small bones, fragments of cloth, and a tiny rusted cross. That discovery halted the project immediately. The government sent archaeologists, historians, forensic teams, tribal elders. They came with clipboards and prayers. What they found over the next 3 weeks would shake the country if the country had still been listening. There were tombs without names, shoes without feet, rosaries wrapped around bones. And one day, beneath 6 inches of compacted soil, a technician's hand brushed against something delicate. At first, it looked like wire. But when she cleared away the earth with a soft brush, she saw what it really was: a beaded bracelet, still intact despite the decades. Dark red stones, worn leather cord, tiny carvings on one side, almost erased by time but not completely. She held it under the light, and the camera zoomed in. There, carved by hand, were the faint letters, ATSA. The photo went viral within hours. It wasn't supposed to. One of the interns had snapped a picture and uploaded it with a caption. He had a name. Thousands shared it, then hundreds of thousands. Suddenly, people were asking questions. Who was Atsa? How many others are still buried? Why did no one tell us this in school? Why were we never taught their names? The questions came like a wave. But for one woman, sitting alone in a sunlit kitchen on the Navajo reservation, it wasn't a question at all. It was a name she hadn't spoken aloud in 100 years. Her name was Atsa Yazzie. She was 116 years old, blind in one eye, hands curled from arthritis, voice barely more than a whisper. But when the news showed that bracelet, when the anchor said the name, even if they pronounced it wrong, she knew. She had known that bracelet. She had sewn the leather cord herself when Atsa was 4. Her husband had carved the letters on it with his pocket knife. It was supposed to protect their son, but nothing could. They had taken him when he was 6. They said it was for his future. She had waited for letters, waited for updates, waited for a train to bring him back. It never did. Now, over a century later, she pressed a shaking finger to the television screen, her voice catching as she whispered, "That's my boy." A Navajo social worker helped arrange a call with the investigation team in Pennsylvania. DNA testing confirmed what her heart already knew. The remains were his, or what was left. They offered to return the bracelet to her. She declined. "No," she said gently. "You keep it there. Let it stay. Let people see it. The world had buried him once. She wouldn't let it happen again." A small ceremony was held at the excavation site. Not an official one, not yet. The government was still reviewing the findings, still drafting reports, still calculating the PR cost. But that didn't stop the people. Dozens came: elders, chaitzis, children, activists, priests, survivors. They lit candles, sang in their native tongues, burned sage and cedar, and wept into the open air. In the center of the crowd stood a young Navajo girl, maybe 12. She wore a red ribbon skirt and a denim jacket, and in her hand she held a photo of the bracelet. She stepped up to the microphone. "My name is Atsa Yazzie," she said. "Atsa was my great-great-great-uncle. I never met him, but I carry his name." She held up the picture. "They tried to take his voice, but they didn't take mine. Not today." The crowd clapped softly. Some cried, some stood still, and for the first time in over 100 years, someone called him by name. Atsa, not Alan, not number 2317, not the boy who ran away or the one who died of fever. Just Atsa, the boy who sang to the stars, the brother who dug in the snow for a stone, the child who remembered even when no one else did. Beneath the surface, the bracelet lay quiet once more, but now it carried more than memory. It carried truth, and truth, once uncovered, does not rest. Not again. Not this time. Not until every name is called. The night the DNA results arrived, no one expected the phone to ring. It was past midnight in the Arizona desert. The air was dry, and the wind rattled through the wooden frame of the small hogan where Atsa Yazzie lived, surrounded by desert brush and stars. She hadn't slept. She rarely did anymore. At 116 years old, time had become a different kind of companion, quiet, patient, sometimes cruel. When her great-granddaughter, Mira, answered the call and stepped into the room holding the cordless phone with both hands, her face said everything before her lips did. "It's him," she whispered. Nolan didn't need the details. She didn't need to hear the lab report, the confirmation code, the statement from the Pennsylvania coroner's office. She already knew. They sat in silence for a long time. Nalan's hands, gnarled from age and arthritis, rested in her lap as she stared into the dark. The old wood stove crackled softly, casting orange light across the room. Her eyes were cloudy, one of them nearly blind, but they held the kind of weight that only grief and long memory can create. After a while, she asked, "Did they find his hair?" Mira blinked. "His hair?" "Yes," Nalan said softly. "When they took him, they cut it. He cried for 3 days. He used to braid it every morning. He said it made him feel strong." Mira's eyes filled with tears. "No, Nana," she whispered, "just bones." "And the bracelet." Nalan nodded. "That's enough." In the morning, reporters began to call. They wanted her statement, her reaction, her reflection. They called it historic. They said she was the last living mother of a Carlisle student. They asked her how it felt to finally have closure. She answered only once, "I don't want closure. I want my son." Then she hung up. But not long after, someone else called. Not a journalist, not a government official. A woman named Delia Redfeather, a Lakota elder, a survivor of the same system. She had read about Nalan in a newspaper clipping passed around at her community center. "I just wanted to say," Delia said through the phone, "I was at Haskell boarding school in 1932. They took my brother too. He never came back either." There was a pause. "Then, I know what it feels like. To never bury the child you never stopped waiting for." Nalan sat quietly, holding the phone to her ear, tears rolling slowly down the creases of her weathered face. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for remembering." The calls kept coming. Not from politicians, not from the Department of the Interior, from grandmothers, from veterans, from school teachers in small towns who had found the article online and realized, for the first time, what their history books never taught them. One woman wrote a letter and mailed it by hand. "My son is 6. I looked at his picture next to Atsa's and I couldn't breathe. I don't know how we let this happen. I'm so sorry." Nalan read every word. Sometimes she asked Mira to read them aloud. Other times she just held the letters to her chest. One morning, Mira found her sitting on the porch, wrapped in a shawl older than both of them, humming something low and slow. "Is that one of your songs?" Mira asked. Nalan nodded. "It's the song I used to sing to Atsa when he couldn't sleep." She looked out toward the distant red mesas. Her voice was hoarse but steady. "I thought if I stopped singing it, he'd disappear for good, so I kept it, for over 100 years, just in case he could still hear it." Mira placed her hand over her grandmother's. "I think he did." The tribe organized a memorial, not a funeral. Nalan insisted on that. "It's not goodbye," she said. "It's recognition." They gathered in a wide circle near the sacred springs. Children held signs with the names of boarding school victims. Dancers moved in, slow, prayerful rhythm. Drums echoed through the desert like a heartbeat returned. And in the center sat Nalan, holding a photo of Atsa, the same one taken just before he left his hair braided, his eyes curious, his mouth slightly open, like he was about to ask a question he never got to finish. She held the photo like it was still warm. When it was her turn to speak, she stood slowly tall, straight, proud. Her voice quivered only once. "They took my son from me when he was 6. They said it was for his own good, for a better life, for civilization." She looked at the children in front of her. "But I've lived 116 years. I've outlived presidents and wars and seasons, and I'm here to tell you." Her eyes flashed. They were wrong. She raised the photo high, and the crowd went silent. "My son's name is Atsa Yazzie. He is not a number. He is not a file. He is not a ghost." She pointed toward the horizon. "He is the wind. He is the fire, he is still here, and I, his mother, am still here too. The wind stirred, as if responding to her voice. And in that moment, with the desert watching, the sun listening, and 100 hearts pounding in time, Atsa came home. The ceremony was set for sunrise, not by accident, not for aesthetics, but because in Navajo belief, dawn is where life begins again, where the darkness yields, where healing enters, and after 140 years of silence, forgetting, and pretending, this land needed healing. So did its people. They came from all over. Some flew in from Minnesota, Oklahoma, Arizona. Others drove through the night across winding mountain passes and frozen highways. They brought children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. Some came wearing regalia stitched by grandmothers long past. Others came in plain jeans and coats, clutching nothing but names on paper. No one arrived empty. They brought memory, they brought pain, they brought names. The Carlisle Indian Industrial School had long since closed its buildings, abandoned, sold off, or demolished. But the earth still remembered, and on this morning, a circle formed on the field where young boys once stood in military drills, forced to march with wooden rifles instead of feathers and drums. Only this time, no one barked orders. No one told them to speak English only. No one told them their names weren't worthy. A young Lakota man stepped to the mic. His voice cracked on the first syllable, but he kept going. "My brother died here," he said. "They said he got sick, but he got sick because they broke him. I came to speak his name today, the Sina Luda." He placed a small red cloth on the earth. Others followed. A northern Cheyenne grandmother called out a name in a trembling voice. A Cherokee girl whispered her ancestor's name with her eyes closed. A Dakota elder pounded a small hand drum, each beat echoing a name no school ever wrote down. The wind carried them all. Toward the end of the morning, Atsa Yazzie stepped forward. She held Nalan's hand as they walked, two women, 4 generations apart, bound by the name of a boy who had once been stolen and silenced. In Mira's other hand was a photo. Atsa, in his traditional clothes, age 5, smiling with a stick, bow slung across his back, hair braided, eyes alive. She stepped up to the podium. She didn't speak at first. She looked out at the field, at the patches of snow melting under the weak January sun, at the faces staring back, some with tears, some with fists clenched in silent grief. Then she turned toward her grandmother, who sat in a chair beside the mic, wrapped in a red wool shawl. Mira's voice was soft but firm. He was 6 when they took him. They said he'd come home stronger. She looked down, but he came back in a box they buried without a name, without ceremony, without apology. She held up the bracelet, the one they had found beneath the soil, cleaned gently, now restored and strung on a leather band. "We're not here to forgive. Not yet. Maybe not ever." She looked toward the eastern horizon, now glowing gold. "We're here to do what they never did." She turned to Nalan. "Would you like to say it?" The old woman nodded. The crowd went silent. The air thickened. And with a voice weathered by time, but steady as stone, Atsa Yazzie said, "My son's name is Atsa Yazzie, and I call him home now. I call him back from the dark." The drums began again, not mournful this time, but resolute. Each beat like a heartbeat, each chant like the sun cracking through clouds. Children, many too young to fully understand, stepped forward one by one, each holding a card with a name written by hand. They laid them on the earth. Dozens, then hundreds. Some names had been passed down in stories. Others had been uncovered in archives, whispered in dreams, found in letters crumbling with time. Atsa was no longer alone. After the ceremony, people lingered. Some wept into shoulders. Some sat silently in the snow, staring at the bracelets, the feathers, the bundles of sage laid on the earth. But most stayed to speak names. One father held his daughter's hand and knelt by the memorial. "You see that name, sweetheart?" he said, pointing to a card. "That was your great-uncle." The girl looked up. "They didn't let him come home?" "No, but we're bringing him home now." Reporters tried to get sound bites, but most people wouldn't speak to them. This wasn't for headlines. This wasn't for apology. This was for the names. Before leaving, Mira stood by the field one last time. She looked out at the horizon where the sun had fully risen now and whispered, "We'll say your name, Atsa, until every child is called back." until no one forgets. She kissed the bracelet once, then placed it on the altar among the others. The wind rose gently, and somewhere in the quiet, a voice called back. The field had emptied, but the memory didn't. Long after the cameras were packed away, and the crowds had returned to their cars, a stillness settled over Carlisle. Not peaceful, never peaceful, but honest. A silence that no longer felt like denial, but recognition. Atsa's name had been spoken. His story had been told. But healing, true healing, was not a single ceremony. It was not one headline or one plaque or one day of reckoning. Healing, Nayland knew, was like rain in the desert. It arrived slowly, in whispers, and only after generations of drought. 2 weeks later, Mira sat with her grandmother on the porch of their home in Arizona. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the red clay earth. A breeze stirred the sagebrush, and somewhere in the distance, coyotes cried into the dusk. Mira poured 2 cups of tea and handed one to Nayland. "You did something powerful," she said softly. Nayland stared out toward the horizon, her voice barely above the wind. "I didn't do it for power. I did it because he never had a voice. He was a child, and they turned him into a secret." She took a slow sip of her tea. "But now they know. The earth knows. And maybe the sky does too." Mira reached into her bag and pulled out a folded newspaper. "Look." On the front page was a photograph of the memorial field. In the foreground, dozens of children stood in a wide circle, each holding up a card with a name. The headline read, "Speak Their Names, The Reckoning of America's Lost Children." Below the title, in smaller print, Atsa Yazzie, finally called home. Nayland traced the image with her finger. Her hand trembled. "I never thought I'd live long enough to see his name written down, let alone spoken again." She folded the paper carefully and placed it on her lap. "But now comes the hard part," she said. "What will they do with that truth?" Across the country, the answer was uncertain. Some schools began adding native boarding school history into their curricula. A few governors issued apologies. One senator proposed a National Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But change came slowly and unevenly. In some towns, parents protested the idea of teaching such dark material. In others, survivors were still afraid to speak, afraid they'd be told, again, to be silent, to move on. In Washington, a committee debated whether financial reparations should be discussed. Meanwhile, the graves kept being discovered. Kansas, Montana, New Mexico. Even as late as 2023, more unmarked plots were found, bones no larger than a child's forearm, still wrapped in school-issued cloth, buried under false names and forgotten soil. The truth had surfaced, but it was not done bleeding. Back in Arizona, Mira began collecting stories. She interviewed elders, translated journals, gathered testimonies from survivors across tribes. Some were eager to talk, others needed time, and some too many were already gone. She titled the project Whispers from the Cut Hair, a living archive, a digital map of names, schools, photos, songs, a resurrection. She wasn't trying to be a historian. She was trying to be a bridge. One day, Mira received a message from a high school student in Idaho. It read, "I never knew any of this. I thought Native kids just went to regular schools. I'm 17 and I'm Native. My grandma was in one of those places. I started asking her about it. Thank you." Mira read the message 3 times. Then she forwarded it to Nayland, who sat quietly for a long while after reading. Finally, she said, "Maybe that boy will call his grandmother by her real name now, not the one the school gave her." That night, as the stars emerged one by one, Nayland sat alone under the sky. She lit a small fire in the center of a ring of stones. Just like her father once did, just like Atsa used to sit beside, she whispered his name again. Not with grief, with belonging. Atsa Yazzie. She imagined him there beside her, his head resting on her lap, his bracelet still glowing with the heat of memory. She imagined his laughter, the way he used to chase the goats barefoot, the way he refused to eat squash unless it was mashed with pine nuts. He was gone, but he had left something behind, not just pain, legacy. The next morning, Mira carved something into a cedar plank and drove with her grandmother to the community center. Together, they nailed it to the wall just above the doorway, where everyone could see it as they walked in. The sign read, "This is where we remember, where we say their names, and where silence is no longer welcome." In the months that followed, children began gathering at the center. Not just Navajo, Hopi, Lakota, Ojibwe, Apache. They came to dance, to paint, to speak their languages again. One day, Mira overheard a girl ask her friend, "What would your Indian boarding school name have been?" The friend answered, "Doesn't matter. I have my real name now." Mira smiled, and far away, in a quiet field where the earth once swallowed everything, the wind blew gently across the markers, rustling the ribbons and cards like chimes. If you stood still, really still, you might swear you could hear them, the voices. Not in pain, not in fear, but in strength and in song and in names finally spoken. If this story moved you even just a little, drop a number 1 in the comments to show you're one of the people who refuse to forget. Your voice matters. Every comment, every share, every time we speak their names, we bring them back from silence. And remember, the past isn't just behind us, it's still shaping who gets heard, who gets erased, and who gets to heal. The real question is, will you be one of the people who kept walking, or one of the few who finally turned around and said, "No more"?